Hello, beloved. Today's fairy tale, The Gift. Once upon a time, a princess was born in a castle on a mountain. But on her naming day, she accidentally got skipped by the fairy of kindness, and so she kind of grew up to be a brat. When she was finally old enough to get married, her father held a tournament, but he let the princess decide what challenges the suitors would face, and the princess got to decide who would win. But this story isn't really about her. This story is about two of the suitors that tried to win her hand in marriage. The first was a nobleman, and he was a very good nobleman because he remembered the true meaning of nobility, and he took very good care of the people that he was responsible for. All of the servants and serfs who lived on his estates were well fed and happy, and they were very glad that they lived there. But unfortunately, being a good noble didn't raise a lot of money, and he had to find a way to get more money coming in, or he wouldn't be able to take good care of his people. And so he decided that he would vie for the hand of the princess. He'd heard some really nasty things about her, but he figured that if they didn't get along, she could live in the palace and he'd live on his estate. The second suitor was a farmer, and he had spent his whole life helping his family on the farm. They had started off with a little flower stand and done well enough to buy their own flower beds and hothouses. And they raised roses and flowers, and soon they had beehives to pollinate the flowers, and they were known for the most rarest and exotic honey and flowers in the entire kingdom. But because he'd spent his whole life working on the farm, he'd never had time to get married or have children. He had his brothers and sisters, and they had family, but he was alone except for his mom and dad. And his mom had passed away, and his dad was very ill. And his father's last wish was that his son find someone to be with, because he was so scared that when he passed away, his son would have no one left to love him or be loved by him. And so the farmer decided that he would suit for the princess's hand, because if his dad knew that he was marrying a princess, he wouldn't be worried about him. He'd know that he'd be taken care of. And he may have heard that she was a bit of a handful, but he'd worked selling flowers to people for his whole life. He was used to tough customers, and he knew how to handle that. And so when the time came, they were both standing before the reception hall waiting to go in to see the princess. And they were sitting in the waiting room. And the nobleman was called first because, nobles always get called first. And so he goes in and he stands before the princess and he says, "My lady, I would like to challenge for your hand in marriage." And the princess looks him up and down and she gives a little sneer. And she says, "Oh, well, you have to complete a challenge first. And I think for you, I want you to bring me the rarest rose in the land, and it has to be blooming when you hand it to me." And the noble thought, "I don't know anything about flowers. I'm a noble. I know poems. I have a library. I know how to write and manage estates. How am I going to get a flower?" But he looked at the princess and he said, "As you wish." And he bowed and he slowly left the chamber. Now the farmer was waiting outside, and he saw the prince go in looking confident and proud. And he saw him come out looking heartbroken and desperate. And his name was called. He stood up and he went in before the princess. And he stopped before her and he said, "Ma'am, I reckon I'd like to challenge for your hand, if you'd have me." And the princess stifles a giggle and she looks him up and down and she said, "Oh, I know just the challenge for you. I want you to bring me the first poem ever written by Bertrand de Villon. And you have to recite it to me flawlessly." The farmer thinks to himself, "Well, that's something." And he looks at the princess. He says, "That's what you want. That's what you'll get." And turned around and left the chamber. But as he was walking through the waiting room, he saw the nobleman sitting there with his head in his hands. And he stopped before the nobleman and he said, "You all right there, fella?" And the nobleman looks up and he says, I don't know anything about flowers. What is the rarest rose in the kingdom anyways? And the farmer goes, and the nobleman says, why are you laughing? And the farmer goes, I reckon we might be able to help each other. He says, do you know anything about a poet named Bertrand de Bayeux? And the nobleman stifles his own giggle and he says, do you mean Bertrand de Bayeux? And the farmer says, that's the fella. I need to find the first poem ever written by that bloke and learn to memorize it and recite it flawlessly. And the nobleman says, well, I love that poet. I have all of his works. I even have his very first poem. And it shouldn't be that hard, because here's what the princess hadn't realized when she assigned the challenge to the farmer. Bertrand de Bayeux was renowned for writing epic poems. One of them could fill an entire volume by itself. But just like everyone else, he had started small, and his first poem was actually really short and pretty easy to memorize. But she assumed that all of his poetry was like his final works. So the nobleman goes, I can teach you that poem. And the farmer says, and I have a cutting of the rose you need in my gardens. But it's very finicky to grow, so we're going to have to set up a hot house and grow it. It's going to take some time. And the nobleman says, well, that gives me time to teach you the poem then, doesn't it? And so the two men teamed up, and they went to the farmer's house, and he introduced the nobleman to his father, and he collected the cutting and all the things that he would need to grow it. And they went to the nobleman's estate, and since it had to be in a special greenhouse, the nobleman and the farmer spent most of the first few weeks in the library designing the greenhouse and then building it. And since the farmer didn't know what to do with himself if he wasn't working, he designed a whole set of gardens for the nobleman as well. And they would be raising herbs and flowers and things that they could sell to bring money into the nobleman's estate. And as the two got to talking every day, the first thing in the morning, the nobleman would recite the poem to the farmer, and the farmer would try to recite it back. And soon the farmer was out building the greenhouse and the gardens, and so the nobleman brought his books out to the garden, and he would spend time sitting and reading poetry and poems and doing his accounts in the garden while the farmer worked around him, and the two would talk, and they became the best of friends. The farmer and the nobleman were opposite in every way, but they balanced each other well. And as time went by, the little rose grew, and then it blossomed, and soon the little bud was getting ready to bloom. And the farmer knew that they would have to pack up and head to the city if the rose was to be blooming the moment they handed it to the princess. And by now, he had the poem memorized. And so the two men packed up with the plant, and they headed to the city, and they got into the reception hall, and they were waiting their turn before the princess. And the nobleman was called up first because, nobles always get called first. And he had the rose hidden behind his back, and he stops before the princess. He goes up 3 flights of stairs, and he stops before her, and he brings out the rose, and it's the most glorious rose. It's deep, dark black, shading to purple at the tips. And it's just in the height of perfection. The bud is just starting to unfurl. It is a perfect rose. And he pulls it out and he hands it to the princess, and he says, the most rarest flower rose in the kingdom, for the rarest beauty in the kingdom. And he offers it to her. And the princess takes the rose and she looks at it. She sniffs it and she says, oh, well, that doesn't smell as good as I thought it would. And she tossed it over her shoulder onto a pile of gifts that had been brought before her, and just left it there to wither and wilt. And the nobleman lowers his head because he knows that she ain't going to marry him, and he doesn't know how he's going to handle his estates. But he slowly goes back down the 3 steps, and he stops beside his friend, the farmer. And then the farmer is called up, and he walks up the 3 steps, and he walks right past the princess to the rose that's still sitting on top of the pile of treasures. And he picks it up, and he comes back and he stops before the princess, and he turns to face her. And he says, "You sent me to find you a poem by Bertrand de Vieux and to recite it for you flawlessly. I've done more than that. I found the meaning of the poem." And he walked down the stairs, and he stopped and knelt before the nobleman. And he took the nobleman's hand in his, and he placed the rose in it, and he recited the poem one more time for the nobleman. If there's one gift in all this life that I could claim for me, it would be to spend it walking side by side with thee. Will you marry me? And the nobleman looked down at him and he said, "What took you so long?" And they loved happily ever after. Love ya. Come back again.